There is a question that civilization has never fully answered, a question that sits at the very nerve of modern political life, a question that one man in the 18th century asked so devastatingly, so personally, and so recklessly that the reverberations have never stopped. The question is this: what if progress is not liberation? What if every step forward that society takes away from the raw and unpredictable condition of nature is in fact a step deeper into corruption, into vanity, into servitude? What if the arts, the sciences, the laws, the institutions, and the accumulated refinements of civilization have not made us freer or more virtuous, but only more dependent, more envious, more morally hollow, and more efficiently organized in our cruelty? What if the most dangerous thing ever invented was not the cannon or the plague, but the idea of private property? And what if the only authentic freedom left to modern man requires not the expansion of his individual rights, but the total submission of his individual will to something called the general will, a collective moral consciousness so pure and so sovereign that to resist it is not merely illegal, but philosophically incoherent? The man who asked all of these questions, who lived inside all of these contradictions, who wept in public and drove his friends to exasperation and his enemies to fury and his disciples to revolution, was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, born in Geneva in 1712, dead in France in 1778, buried eventually beneath the Pantheon alongside the rationalists he had spent his life attacking, and still, 2.5 centuries later, impossibly, uncomfortably, unavoidably alive in every argument about nature and society, feeling and reason, the individual and the collective, the authentic self and the mask we wear to survive among other human beings. To understand Rousseau is not merely to understand. An eccentric philosopher of the French Enlightenment, it is to understand the psychological architecture behind some of the most transformative and some of the most terrifying political movements in modern history. It is to trace a line from the banks of Lake Geneva through the salons of Paris, through the revolutionary tribunals of the Terror, through the romantic movements of the 19th century, through the nationalist revolutions of the 20th, through the identity politics and authenticity culture and populist insurgencies of the 21st. It is to follow an idea as it mutates across time, absorbing the anxieties of each new generation, becoming something its author might not have recognized, but would certainly have felt. Because Rousseau's philosophy was never primarily an intellectual system, it was a cry of pain organized into theory, and pain, unlike argument, does not expire. The urgency that runs through every page he ever wrote is not the urgency of a man reaching for an idea, but the urgency of a man fleeing a wound. And the wound preceded the philosophy by decades. It was open and bleeding long before it found its philosophical name. Geneva, in the early 18th century, was a city of clocks and Calvian, a city where precision and piety competed for supremacy, where civic virtue was not merely encouraged but enforced, where the moral atmosphere was dense with expectation and the social hierarchy was rigid enough to feel like architecture. It was a small republic of approximately 20,000 citizens, proud of its independence, organized around an oligarchic council structure that exercised far more authority than its nominally democratic rhetoric suggested. It was a city that talked incessantly about freedom, while administering a social order in which every deviation from civic convention was noted and potentially punished. It was, in other words, the perfect laboratory for the psychology that Rousseau would eventually develop, a place in which the gap between official principle and lived reality was wide enough to generate a lifetime of philosophical discontent, And it was into this world that Suzanne Bernard Rousseau, a woman of sensitivity and literary inclination, brought her second son on the 28th of June 1712, and then died 9 days later of puerperal fever, leaving behind a husband incapable of managing grief, a city indifferent to private suffering, and an infant who had spent the rest of his life trying to understand what had been taken from him before he was old enough to know he had it. The loss of his mother was, in the most precise sense, Rousseau's foundational event, not merely his biography, but his philosophy. Because the child who loses a mother at birth loses not a person, but a concept. He loses the idea of unconditional belonging, the wordless assurance that existence itself is welcome, that the world into which one has arrived is fundamentally hospitable. And Rousseau denied this assurance from his very first days of consciousness, spent his entire life constructing elaborate theoretical alternatives to it: the state of nature, the general will, the social contract, the ideal of civic community, the concept of the authentic self that exists prior to social corruption. All of these ideas are, at some level, attempts to reconstruct in the domain of philosophy what was destroyed in the domain of experience before experience could properly begin. This is not to reduce his philosophy to his psychology. Ideas have their own momentum and their own validity, independent of their emotional origins. But it is to insist that the emotional origins matter, that they shaped not just the texture of his thought, but its deeper structure, its most characteristic moves, its most revealing silences. His father, Isaac Rousseau, was a watchmaker of some skill and considerable instability, a man who loved his remaining son with a volatile and consuming intensity, who read novels aloud with him through the night until the sun rose over the lake and they wept together over fictional tragedies without yet fully processing their own, who projected onto the boy the entire weight of his longing for the wife he had lost, and who then, when Jean-Jacques was 10 years old, fled Geneva after a quarrel with a French army captain threatened him with imprisonment, leaving his son behind in the care of relatives with a speed that suggested his own survival was, in the end, the priority. This second abandonment, this paternal disappearance following the maternal death, created in Rousseau a psychological pattern that would define his relationships for the rest of his life, a desperate need for intimacy combined with an expectation of its withdrawal, an oscillation between complete trust and complete suspicion, between ecstatic connection and wounded isolation, between the conviction that he deserved total acceptance and the equally powerful conviction that everyone around him was secretly conspiring to destroy him. It is a pattern recognizable to any student of attachment theory. The anxious, preoccupied attachment style that emerges from early experiences of unreliable caregiving. And it is a pattern that drove both his personal relationships and his political philosophy in directions that his rational intelligence could not fully control. He was sent to board with a pastor in Bassy, a village outside Geneva, where he was cared for reasonably but without warmth. Educated in Latin and religion and the disciplines of a modest Protestant household, and where he first encountered the experience that would become one of his most famous confessions, the experience of being unjustly punished, accused of breaking a comb he had not broken, punished without evidence, and discovering with a shock of moral indignation that the social world operated not on the principle of truth but on the principle of power, that innocence offered no protection, that authority could be arbitrary and cruel, and that the pain of injustice felt qualitatively different from physical pain, more lasting, more destabilizing, more corrosive to one's sense of the world as a place where rightness and goodness have any reliable purchase. This episode, trivial by almost any external measure, lodged itself so deeply in Rousseau's consciousness that decades later he would recall it with undiminished precision in the Confessions. And it is worth pausing to consider why, because what Rousseau was recording was not merely a childhood grievance, but the first crystallization of his lifelong conviction that society, however it presented itself, was fundamentally rigged against authentic virtue. That the institutions of human order were not instruments of justice, but instruments of power dressed in the language of justice. And that the person of genuine sensitivity and genuine innocence would always be vulnerable to the arbitrary cruelty of those who controlled the interpretation of events. By his early teens, he had been apprenticed to an engraver in Geneva, a man of rough temperament and limited patience. And Rousseau found the work degrading, the authority arbitrary, and the social position humiliating. He began to steal small things, to lie with some facility, to develop the habits of resentment and concealment that thrive in conditions of powerlessness. And then, at the age of 16, returning from a Sunday walk outside the city gates and finding them closed against him, rather than face the consequences of being locked out, he simply kept walking away from Geneva, away from his apprenticeship, away from the settled if constrained identity that the city had offered him, into a wandering life that would last, in various forms, for decades. It was not a heroic departure, it was the flight of a wounded adolescent with no clear destination and no particular plan. But it was also, in retrospect, the first act of a man who would spend his entire philosophical career arguing that the conventions of society were a prison, and who could not, even at 16, make himself stay inside one. The irony that would haunt him all his life was already present in this moment. The man who would argue most powerfully for the social contract was constitutionally incapable of honoring the social contracts that were immediately available to him. He arrived at Annecy in Savoy and was directed to the house of a young widow named Françoise Louise de Warens, a woman of charm, intellectual generosity, and complicated personal history, 12 years his senior, who took him in with an ease and warmth that astonished him, who converted him to Catholicism with a practicality that suggested theology was somewhat beside the point, and who became, over the following years, the most significant emotional relationship of his young life. She was, in the vocabulary he himself would later construct, the figure who temporarily repaired the foundational damage, who provided something approximating the unconditional welcome he had never received. And he called her with a tenderness that reveals more than he perhaps intended. Maman, not woman, not lover, not patron, but mother, the very thing he had never had, the very thing he had been, from the moment of his birth, in perpetual mourning. For she was not ideal, she had her own entanglements and her own moral complexities. And the relationship eventually became physical in a way that its maternal framing made psychologically complicated for both of them. But for the adolescent Rousseau, she represented something irreplaceable, a human being who appeared to receive him without conditions, without the demand that he perform or compete or pretend, and the fact that this reception was eventually withdrawn, replaced by the arrival of other protégés who competed for her attention and eventually displaced him, would become another entry in the psychological ledger of abandonment that his philosophy was steadily constructing. His years with Madame de Warens were not uniformly happy. They were interrupted by wandering, by failed employment, by periods of illness that were partly physical and partly the expression in bodily form of psychological distress. And eventually, by the arrival of rivals for her affection. But there were years in which something was being assembled inside him, a sense of intellectual possibility, of genuine feeling as a guide to truth, of nature as a moral category rather than merely a physical one. He educated himself voraciously and reading philosophy and music and natural history with equal appetite and unequal discipline, walking for hours through the alpine countryside around Chambry and Les Charmettes, discovering in the rhythms of solitary movement through natural landscape a clarity and a peace that social life consistently denied him. It was during these wandering years that the central intuition of his philosophy began to take shape. Not yet as argument, but as felt experience, the conviction that he was more himself, more honest, more morally coherent, when alone in nature than when performing the social roles the Parisian civilization demanded. This was not yet a political theory. It was a psychological discovery, but it was a discovery that would eventually change the world. He arrived in Paris in 1742, a provincial young man of 30 with a new system of musical notation, grand ambitions, and no connections. And Paris received him with the magnificent indifference that great cities reserve for the merely talented. He failed to impress the Academy of Sciences with his musical system, failed to establish himself as a composer, and found himself surviving on the margins of the intellectual world, copying music for income, serving briefly as secretary to the French ambassador in Venice, accumulating experiences of frustration and social humiliation that fed the resentment, already growing at the center of his character. It was in Paris that he met Denis Diderot, the brilliant and generous editor of the Encyclopédie, and through Diderot he entered the world of the Philosopher, the network of enlightened intellectuals who believed that reason, science, and progress were the engines of human liberation, who believed that the systematic accumulation of knowledge would dissolve the superstitions of the church and the tyrannies of the state and reveal a world ordered by rational principle for the benefit of all. He sat at their tables. He argued their arguments. He was, by most accounts, a stimulating and deeply uncomfortable companion, a man of evident intelligence and uncertain social calibration, who said things in salons that one was not supposed to say quite so directly, and who felt, always, even in the company of those who most admired him, the specific loneliness of the person who cannot quite make himself belong. It was also in Paris that he formed the domestic arrangement that would generate the most famous and the most damaging contradiction of his life. He met Thérèse Levasseur, a Parisian laundress of little formal education, considerable practical intelligence, and extraordinary patience. And he entered into a relationship with her that would last, in various forms, for the rest of his life. He would eventually go through a form of marriage ceremony with her, though he never formally married her, and he would describe her in his writings with a combination of condescension and genuine affection that reveals a man profoundly incapable of treating an intimate partner as a full moral equal. She was, in his account, simple where he was complex, practical where he was theoretical, reliable where he was mercurial. And the relationship worked partly because she did not challenge him intellectually and partly because she provided the mystic stability that his psychological constitution required without the emotional demands that he found intolerable. In the summer of 1749, walking from Paris to Vincennes to visit Diderot, who was imprisoned there for the publication of his letter on the blind, Rousseau stopped to rest beneath a tree and opened a copy of the Mercure de France, and there encountered the question posed by the Academy of Dijon for its annual essay. Prize: has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to the purification of morals? It was not, on its face, a surprising question for an Enlightenment institution to ask, expecting, of course, an answer that celebrated the progressive and civilizing power of knowledge. But what happened to Rousseau beneath that tree? What he would later describe in newer mystical terms as an illumination so sudden and so overwhelming that it left him trembling. Weeping, unable to move, was not a discovery of the expected answer, but of its precise opposite in that moment, or in the construction of that moment that his memory would elaborate over the following decades. Rousseau grasped with the force of genuine revelation that the answer to the Academy's question was no. Emphatically no, that the sciences and arts had not purified morals, but corrupted them. That civilization was not the solution to human misery, but its primary cause. That progress was a story mankind told itself to disguise the magnitude of what it had lost. He later recalled that the illumination was so powerful that if he had been able to write down a fraction of the ideas that flooded him in those moments, beneath the tree he would have produced a great work, and that he arrived at Vincennes in a state of agitation so intense that Diderot, seeing him, knew immediately that something had broken open. His discourse on the sciences and arts, which won the Déjeuner Prize in 1750 and was published the following year, is a document of startling audacity and deliberate provocation. It opens not with argument, but with accusation, charging the Enlightenment project with a fundamental moral dishonesty. And it deploys the rhetorical energy of a man who has finally found the name for something he has felt his entire life. Rousseau's claim is structured with deceptive elegance. He argues that the sophistication of a civilization and the virtue of its people exist in inverse proportion, that the nations most renowned for their arts and sciences, Athens, Rome, China, France, are precisely the nations whose moral fabric is most thoroughly rotted, that the Spartans and the early Romans, those rough and supposedly primitive peoples, were more virtuous precisely because they had not yet been seduced by the refinements of culture, that luxury breeds inequality. Inequality breeds resentment. Resentment breeds the elaborate social performances of politeness and wit and fashion, through which the modern European navigates a world of permanent competition disguised as civility. And that this performance, however dazzling, is the opposite of moral authenticity. What made the discourse on the sciences and arts so disruptive was not merely its conclusion, but its methodology. Because Rousseau was attacking the Enlightenment from within its own framework, using the rhetorical tools of rational argument to argue against the primacy of rational argument, deploying historical evidence to challenge the progressive interpretation of history, and doing so with a stylistic brilliance that demonstrated, somewhat uncomfortably, that he was himself among the finest products of the very civilization he was condemning. The Philosopher were simultaneously delighted by his provocation and deeply unsettled by it. Voltaire wrote to congratulate him with an irony so refined. It functioned as both praise and insult, suggesting that after reading Rousseau, one felt a great desire to walk on all fours, which was not quite the response Rousseau had hoped for. But the discourse made him famous in a way that his previous work had not. It gave him a public identity, the solitary walker against the salon, the man of feeling against the men of wit, the prophet against the philosophers, and it was an identity that, once assumed, became increasingly difficult to inhabit with intellectual honesty, because the position requires a consistency between life and thought that Rousseau's life was constitutively incapable of providing. The Discourse on Inequality, published in 1755 in response to a second Déjeuner Prize question, went further still. It is a longer, more carefully constructed, and philosophically deeper work, and it contains Rousseau's most radical and most controversial idea, the famous or infamous state of nature, which has been misunderstood in almost every generation. Since he wrote it, it is essential to understand what Rousseau was and was not claiming. He was not claiming that human beings had actually lived in a state of nature in any recoverable historical sense. He acknowledged explicitly that his account was hypothetical, a philosophical construction designed to isolate the original properties of human nature from those accumulated through social development. He was performing a kind of philosophical experiment, asking what man would be like if you stripped away everything that society had added, every convention, every institution, every habit of mind, every form of dependence, what would remain? And his answer was a creature of remarkable self-sufficiency, capable of satisfying its physical needs, endowed with a natural compassion for the suffering of others, which he called pity, and entirely free from the destructive passions that torment social man, vanity, envy, the need for comparison and superiority, which he called amour propre, the noble savage, as this figure came to be caricatured. Was never noble in any heroic sense in Rousseau's actual text. He was simply unencumbered. He was a creature who suffered without the additional torment of self-consciousness, who competed without the poison of status anxiety, who died without the fear of social humiliation. And Rousseau's point was not that we should return to this condition, which he repeatedly said was impossible and undesirable, but that understanding it reveals what civilization has cost us, reveals which human suffering is natural and unavoidable and which is artificial and therefore potentially remediable. The great original sin in Rousseau's account was not disobedience to God, but the fencing off of a piece of ground. The first man who said, "This is mine," and found others foolish enough to believe him, in Rousseau's devastating formulation, was the true founder of civil society, and civil society, built on this original act of exclusion, carried within itself, from the beginning, the structure of inequality that would flower into oppression. And it is worth noting that Rousseau published this argument in a book dedicated to the Republic of Geneva, his birthplace, which he had idealized into an image of civic virtue so remote from the Geneva that actually existed that the dedication reads, in retrospect, less like gratitude than like a projection of the very state of nature onto an available political canvas. The question of whether modern anthropology and archaeology vindicate or refute Rousseau's account of pre-social man is complex and in some ways beside his actual philosophical point. It is true that the evidence from archaeology, evolutionary biology, and the study of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies paints a picture considerably more violent, more hierarchical, and more socially structured than Rousseau's solitary wanderer. Violence rates in prehistoric societies were, by most measures, considerably higher than in modern states. Kinship networks and status hierarchies appear to be among the oldest features of human social organization rather than later developments. Cooperative hunting and food-sharing practices, while real and important, were embedded in structures of obligation and social rank that undercut the picture of natural independence Rousseau was painting, and the idea of a pre-social individual capable of genuinely solitary existence contradicts what we now understand about the evolutionary origins of human cognition in deeply social contexts. Human beings are not merely social by cultural convention, they are social by biological constitution, and the individual that Rousseau imagined wandering alone and self-sufficient through a bountiful natural world is from the perspective of contemporary evolutionary biology, a conceptual impossibility. But Rousseau was not writing evolutionary biology. He was performing a moral thought experiment, and the function of his state of nature was never to describe history, but to provide a critical standard against which to measure the present. In this sense, it functions less like a historical claim and more like what Kant would later describe as a regulative ideal, a fictional reference point that organizes moral judgment without necessarily corresponding to any actual past or possible future. The question it is designed to answer is not what were we, but what might we have been, without the specific distortions that the specific institutions of existing civilization have introduced. And that question, however methodologically problematic, does real philosophical work. It forces us to ask which features of human social life are genuinely necessary and which are merely contingent products of historical developments that could have been otherwise. It provides a critical lever with which to pry open the assumption, always convenient to those who benefit from existing arrangements, that the current order of things is the natural and inevitable expression of human nature, rather than one possible arrangement among many. What the state of nature did represent, with a psychological honesty that no amount of philosophical sophistication can entirely disguise, was Rousseau's own longing for a condition of complete acceptance without performance, a condition in which he would not need to compete for recognition, would not be subject to the arbitrary judgments of others, would not have to navigate the endless social negotiations of Parisian intellectual life that left him simultaneously celebrated and humiliated. The state of nature was, at some level, the Geneva he had left at 16, the Charmettes he had shared with Madame de Warrens, the solitary walks through alpine landscape, the self that existed before the world demanded that it had become something else. The philosophical construct and the personal wound were never fully separable in Rousseau, and this is part of what gives his writing its peculiar and enduring power. The feeling of genuine necessity behind every argument, the sense that these are not merely interesting propositions to be evaluated at leisure, but urgent truths that must be expressed or something essential will die. This is the voice of a man for whom philosophy is not an academic exercise but a form of survival, and it is this quality, more than any particular argument, that has ensured his continued influence. It was in 1762, in the extraordinary double publication of Émile and the Social Contract, that Rousseau's thinking reached its fullest and most dangerous elaboration. The Social Contract opens with one of the most famous sentences in the history of political philosophy: "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." It is a sentence of rhetorical perfection and philosophical complexity, because Rousseau is not arguing, as it is sometimes misread, for the liberation of the individual from all social constraint. He is arguing for something considerably stranger and more demanding. He is arguing that the chains in which modern man finds himself are illegitimate, not because they are chains, but because they are the wrong kind of chains. That there exists a form of social order which would preserve and even enhance human freedom rather than destroying it. And that this form of order requires not the diminution of individual will, but its transformation into something that can be simultaneously fully personal and fully civic. The sovereign individual and the sovereign community becoming, in the properly constituted republic, not adversaries, but expressions of the same underlying moral reality. The Social Contract is an attempt to solve what Rousseau calls the fundamental problem of political philosophy, to find a form of association which defends and protects with all common forces the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. The solution he proposes is the social contract itself, in which each individual gives himself entirely to the community, not to any particular person or faction, but to the whole. And because everyone gives equally and entirely, no one ends up obeying anyone but themselves. Because the community is simply all of them taken together, it is an elegant solution and a deeply problematic one, and its problems cluster around the concept at the center of the entire system. The general will, a concept so central to Rousseau's political thought, and so consequential in its subsequent applications, that it demands an extended and careful examination that does justice to both its genuine insight and its structural dangers. The general will is not the will of the majority. It is not the aggregation of individual preferences. It is not public opinion. It is something altogether more demanding and more elusive. It is the will that each citizen would have if they were thinking not about their private interests, but about the common good. It is the will of the community as a rational whole, oriented toward the genuine flourishing of all its members. And it is always right, because by definition it is directed toward the common good, which is the only legitimate object of political authority. The contrast Rousseau draws is between the will of all, which is simply the sum of private interests and may be selfish or short-sighted, and the general will, which transcends private interest and always points toward what is genuinely good for everyone. The citizen who has truly internalized the social contract will want the same thing as the general will, because the citizen's genuine interest is identical with the common interest. The citizen who appears to want something different is simply mistaken about their own interests. They have confused their superficial desires with their genuine will, which is to say, they have been corrupted by the very social forces that the properly constituted republic is designed to cure. The implications of this doctrine are both liberating and terrifying, and the distance between its liberating and its terrifying dimensions is smaller than it first appears. On the liberating side, Rousseau is offering a vision of political life as genuine self-governance, in which the laws that citizens obey are truly their own because they are the expression of their own deepest will. This is civic freedom in a form far more demanding and far more meaningful than the mere absence of external interference. It is the freedom of the person who does what is right, not because they are forced to, but because they have understood why it is right and made it genuinely their own. It is a vision of political community as the highest form of human self-realization, rather than merely a necessary inconvenience. An ideal so compelling that it has continued to inspire serious political philosophy for 2.5 centuries. On the terrifying side, the doctrine creates a structural template for political tyranny of a peculiar and self-concealing kind. If the general will is always right, and if any citizen who disagrees with the general will is merely confused about their own genuine interests, then the political authority that enforces the general will against the objections of dissenting citizens is not oppressing them, but liberating them. It is freeing them from their own false consciousness. It is, in the formulation that is haunted political philosophy ever since, forcing them to be free. This is not a minor theoretical problem that can be dissolved by charitable reading. It is a structural feature of the entire system, and Rousseau was aware enough of it to acknowledge, in one of the most chilling passages in the history of political thought, that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body, which means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. The language of liberation and the mechanics of compulsion occupy the same sentence, the same concept, the same breath. And this is not an accident or a contradiction, but the logical outcome of the system's deepest premise. That individual will and collective will, properly understood, are identical, and that anyone who disputes this identity is simply wrong. Not merely politically wrong, but morally and philosophically wrong. And it is an easy and historically well-documented step from there to the conclusion that the force used to correct this wrongness is not oppression, but education. Not tyranny, but civic virtue. Not a violation of the dissident's rights, but a service rendered to the dissident's deeper self. The self that would agree with the general will if only it were not so thoroughly corrupted by private interest and factional manipulation. The social contract does not fully explain how the general will is to be identified in practice. How one distinguishes between the genuine general will and the will of a faction that has captured the machinery of the state and is presenting its own interests as the common good. Rousseau places enormous weight on the lawgiver, an almost superhuman figure who establishes the foundational institutions of the Republic. A figure who must be wise enough to design a system that will produce virtuous citizens without himself claiming the authority that only those virtuous citizens can legitimately exercise. It is a paradox that Rousseau acknowledges without entirely resolving, and it points to a deeper tension in the whole project. The tension between the conditions required for the social contract to function and the social contract is a description of how legitimate authority is generated. For the general will to operate properly, citizens must already have internalized civic virtue. But the development of civic virtue depends on institutions that themselves require legitimate authority to establish. The system presupposes what it is trying to create, and the lawgiver is the figure invented to paper over this gap, but he papers over it rather than filling it. And the gap remains, opening whenever the question of who speaks for the general will becomes politically urgent. In the same year as the social contract, Rousseau published Emile, his great treatise on education, a work of equal ambition and equal internal tension. Emile imagines the ideal education of a hypothetical boy raised not in the corrupting environment of social institutions but in close contact with nature, guided by a wise tutor who allows experience rather than instruction to be the primary teacher, who protects the child from premature social influence, who nurtures the natural goodness that Rousseau believed was every child's birthright before society got its hands on it. The educational philosophy of Emile is in many respects genuinely radical and genuinely insightful. Its emphasis on allowing children to learn through their senses and through natural consequences rather than through rote memorization and punishment. Its insistence on treating childhood as a distinct stage of development with its own legitimate needs rather than as merely deficient adulthood. Its suspicion of premature abstraction and its trust in embodied learning were ahead of their time in ways that have been broadly vindicated by subsequent developmental psychology and educational theory. The book influenced Pestalozzi, influenced Froebel, influenced Dewey, influenced the entire progressive education tradition, and its central intuition that children learn best when education is adapted to the genuine needs and capacities of their developmental stage, rather than to the convenience of adult institutions, remains one of the most durable insights in the history of educational philosophy. But the existence of Emile as a document is haunted by a biographical fact that Rousseau himself disclosed in the Confessions with a frankness that seems to have been as much about moral exhibitionism as genuine remorse. He had 5 children, with his companion Thérèse Levasseur, and all 5 of those children he sent, shortly after birth, to the Paris Foundling Hospital, the Enfants Trèves, where the overwhelming majority of the children deposited never reached adulthood, condemned by the conditions of institutional care to mortality rates that amounted, statistically, to a collective death sentence. He did this not once, not twice, but 5 times, for 5 children, one after another, and he did it while composing a treatise on the supreme importance of natural and attentive parenting, a treatise that begins with the observation that everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things, and everything degenerates in the hands of man, and that emphasizes throughout the irreplaceable importance of parental care, of maternal nursing, of consistent attention to the developing child. The gap between the theory and the practice is so vast and so precisely calibrated that it demands an explanation that goes beyond ordinary hypocrisy, which is common enough and suggests something more structurally revealing about the relationship between Rousseau's idealism and his capacity for genuine human relationship. The psychological literature on this kind of contradiction is rich, and the temptation to diagnose is strong. But what the documentary record invites is not diagnosis, but interpretation. Several readings present themselves, and none is entirely satisfying. The most charitable reading is that Rousseau genuinely believed, or convinced himself, that the Foundling Hospital offered his children a better chance than he, in his poverty and instability, could provide. This is not impossible, but it is also not credible as a full account, because the conditions of the hospital were widely understood to be catastrophic. And Rousseau was not an ignorant man. A second reading is that Émile was compensation, an elaborate act of theoretical reparation, a working out in the domain of ideas of the care he had refused to provide, in the domain of life, a way of being. The perfect parent in the only space where he could be certain of success, the page, where children do not cry in the night and do not make demands that exceed the philosopher's capacity to manage them, where the ideal remains ideal because it is never submitted to the test of actual practice. A third reading, perhaps the most psychologically searching, is that Rousseau's treatment of his children and his educational philosophy are both expressions of the same underlying structure of feeling. Both are ways of placing the idea of the child in a protected space where it cannot be damaged by the messy, disappointing, obligation-generating reality of actual relationship. The ideal child of Émile and the children dispatched to the Enfants Trèves are both, in a sense, imaginary children, children who have been removed from the domain of real contact, because real contact was what Rousseau, for all his philosophy of feeling, found most difficult to sustain. No account of Rousseau's life and thought can avoid the figure of Voltaire, not because they are simple opposites, though they are often framed that way, but because the conflict between them illuminates with unusual clarity the fault line that runs through the entire Enlightenment, and that continues to organize cultural and political debate in the present day. Voltaire was everything Rousseau was not: cosmopolitan where Rousseau was provincial, ironic where Rousseau was earnest, comfortable with privilege where Rousseau was consumed by resentment of it, committed to reforming civilization from within where Rousseau wanted to indict civilization at its foundations, and above all, Voltaire was a master of wit, of the pointed observation, the devastating epigram, the philosophic joke that reduced the opposing position to visible absurdity, while Rousseau was a master of sentiment, of the earnest declaration. the emotional appeal that bypassed argument and went directly for the conscience. Voltaire laughed and Rousseau wept. And in the 18th century, these were not merely different rhetorical strategies, but different theories of how moral change happens in the world, different accounts of what human beings most fundamentally are and what, therefore, most fundamentally moves them. The antagonism between them was both personal and ideological, and it escalated over the years through a series of exchanges that reveal both men at their most characteristic. When the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 killed tens of thousands of people and provided Voltaire with material for his great poem on the problem of evil, challenging the Leibnizian optimism that insisted everything was for the best in the best of all possible worlds, Rousseau wrote to Voltaire with a response that combined genuine philosophical engagement with a personal presumption so massive that it must have astonished even its recipient, arguing that the victims of the earthquake were at least partly responsible for their own deaths by choosing to live in a dense urban environment, and that the suffering of natural disasters was greatly amplified by the artificial suffering introduced by civilization. It was an argument that managed to be simultaneously philosophically interesting and spectacularly inappropriate as a response to mass death. And it illustrated perfectly the way in which Rousseau's philosophical system, when pressed into service as a response to actual human catastrophe, could generate conclusions that were technically coherent within its own framework and morally obtuse in any framework that took seriously the complexity of human suffering. Voltaire's great satirical masterpiece Candide, published in 1759, is directed primarily at Leibnizian optimism, but contains within it a sustained comic demolition of the idea that natural simplicity is morally superior to civilized complexity. The innocent, candid, wandering through a world of gratuitous catastrophe and institutional evil is a parody of Rousseau's Natural Man. And when Voltaire finally has Candide reach his famous conclusion that one must cultivate one's garden, the message is not merely about the virtue of modest practical engagement, but also a pointed repose to the grandiose philosophical ambitions of a man who was, in Voltaire's view, substituting sentiment for thought and calling it philosophy. The decisive rupture between them came not in a philosophical debate, but in a political intervention of unusual viciousness. In 1764, Voltaire published anonymously a pamphlet revealing that Rousseau had sent his children to the Foundling Hospital, knowing that this disclosure would be devastating, knowing that it would destroy the carefully constructed image of the man of natural feeling and authentic virtue that Rousseau had built around himself. Rousseau was not wrong to feel that this was an attack of a particular kind, an attack not on his arguments, but on his person. But he was also not in a position to answer it with anything other than the confessions, and the confessions, whatever else they are the record of a man who has been wounded badly enough that he has decided to wound himself more thoroughly than any enemy could manage, in the hope that the act of complete self-disclosure will constitute a kind of moral victory. That argument alone cannot achieve. The publication of Emile and the Social Contract in 1762 brought down upon Rousseau the institutional wrath of both France and his native Geneva. Emile was condemned by the Paris Parliament and publicly burned. The Social Contract was condemned and burned by the Geneva authorities, and arrest warrants were issued in both jurisdictions. The condemnation of Emile, which was the more publicly visible scandal, centered on the profession of faith of the Savoyard vicar, a section of the book in which Rousseau laid out a natural religion based on conscience and feeling rather than revealed doctrine, arguing that the voice of conscience was the voice of God, speaking directly to the human heart without the mediation of institutional religion. This was from the perspective of both Catholic and Protestant authorities. Not merely theological error, but theological insolence. A claim that the individual's inner experience was a more reliable guide to divine truth than the accumulated authority of the Church. And the institutional fury with which it was received gives some measure of how genuinely threatening this claim was to the existing order of religious and social authority. Rousseau fled Paris, eventually arriving in Mézières in the Principality of Neuchâtel, under the somewhat uncertain protection of Frederick the Great of Prussia, where he lived for several years in a state of growing paranoia. Convinced that he was surrounded by enemies, that his correspondence was being intercepted, that the philosophes who had once been his allies had organized a systematic conspiracy to destroy his reputation, that the world had declared war on him personally, he took to wearing an Armenian robe as a statement of difference, of non-belonging, of refusal to dress himself in the costume of the civilization that had rejected him. And the villagers of Mézières, who were initially curious, and then increasingly hostile, eventually stoned his house in an episode that, whatever its precise causes and degree of severity, confirmed for Rousseau the narrative he had been constructing for years, that he was not merely unpopular but persecuted, not merely criticized, but hunted, not merely a controversial thinker but a martyr to the truth. His exile from his homeland was not merely a political inconvenience, it was a psychic wound of the deepest kind, because Geneva had always occupied a complex and idealized position in his imagination. He was a Genevan citizen by birth and proud of it. He had dedicated the discourse on inequality to the Republic of Geneva in terms so lavish that the dedication reads more like an act of religious devotion than a dedication to a political entity. He had reconverted to Protestantism partly to reclaim his citizenship, and he had invested in the idea of Geneva as a model of civic virtue and republican simplicity that corresponded to his philosophical ideal. The burning of his books by Genevan authorities was therefore not merely censorship but betrayal, not merely political opposition, but the rejection of the prodigal son by the city that was supposed to be the embodiment of all he valued. And it was a betrayal that pushed him further along the road toward the interpretive framework that would eventually dominate his consciousness entirely. The framework in which everything that went wrong was evidence of persecution, in which every difficulty confirmed a grand narrative of innocence surrounded by conspiracy, in which the grandiosity of his self-perception and the magnitude of his persecution were two sides of the same psychological coin. His stay in England at the invitation of David Hume between 1766 and 1767 has the quality of a tragic comedy. Hume was among the most generous and philosophically capacious men of the century, and his offer to bring Rousseau to England and protect him from his continental enemies was made in genuine goodwill. But Rousseau, by this point, was constitutionally incapable of receiving goodwill without eventually converting it into evidence of malice. He became convinced that Hume was not his protector but his jailer, that the network of Hume's friends was not offering hospitality but conducting surveillance, that he was at the center of a conspiracy so vast and so sophisticated that it included even those who appeared most devoted to him. Hume, a man of extraordinary intellectual patience, eventually lost it, writing letters to mutual friends that describe Rousseau with a precision that veers between clinical and despairing as a man who combined extraordinary sensitivity with an absolute incapacity for sustained relationship. Rousseau's response to Hume's eventual exasperation was to publish an account of the quarrel that presented himself as the injured innocent and Hume is the ringleader of the continental conspiracy against him, a document that embarrassed almost everyone who read it, and that stands as one of the most vivid records of a brilliant mind, consuming itself in paranoid self-justification. The Confessions, which Rousseau began during these years, and which were not published until after his death, are one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of Western literature, and they require a kind of reading that holds simultaneously in mind their literary achievement, their psychological complexity, and their profound unreliability. Rousseau opens with a declaration of unprecedented ambition. He is undertaking to show a man in all the truth of nature, and that man is himself. He claims that he will hide nothing, suppress nothing, permit no false modesty to soften the portrait. That he will lay before the reader not the idealized self that every previous autobiographer had constructed, but the real self, with all its pettiness, its shameful moments, its irrationality, its moral failures. The Confessions contain scenes of genuine personal humiliation, recounted with a candor that remains shocking even across the distance of 2.5 centuries. The episode of the ribbon stolen from a servant, and the false accusation of the young girl Marion, who was left to bear the blame. The various sexual encounters of his youth, some embarrassing and some disturbing by any reasonable moral standard. The relationships conducted with a combination of passion and manipulation that left most of his partners worse off than they had found him. But the Confessions are also, and perhaps primarily, a work of self-justification so thorough that its very thoroughness becomes a form of distortion. Rousseau confesses in order to be forgiven, but more fundamentally in order to control the narrative of his own life. By accusing himself before his enemies can accuse him, by contextualizing every failing within a framework that always restores his fundamental innocence, by presenting his most problematic actions as the products of external pressure, of social corruption, of the inevitable distortion introduced by living in a world that was never adequate to his inner life. He performs the paradox of total confession as total self. What the Confessions created, however, beyond the question of their reliability as autobiography, was something of world historical significance. They established the emotional interior of an individual, with all its contradictions and failures and desires, as a legitimate subject for extended serious attention. They proposed that the inner life was not merely interesting, but morally significant. That the feelings were not merely data, but evidence about the world and about one's place in it. And this proposal, radical in its time, has become so thoroughly absorbed into modern culture that we can barely see it as a proposal at all. It seems simply obvious, it seems simply true, which is itself the best possible measure of how completely Rousseau won the argument he was, making the legacy of the Confessions extend through the Romantic movement, through the confessional novel, through the psychoanalytic tradition, through the modern memoir industry, through the culture of therapeutic self-disclosure, through the social media practice of performing vulnerability as a form of connection. In every context in which a person declares that their feelings are the most reliable guide to their moral situation, in every context in which authenticity is held to be a higher value than correctness, in every context in which the honest expression of emotion is treated as itself a form of moral virtue. The ghost of Rousseau is present. His Confessions inaugurated what we might call the age of sincerity, in which the display of genuine feeling becomes not merely a personal act, but a claim to moral authority. And this age has been both liberating and troubled. Both a genuine expansion of human self-understanding and a template for the manipulation of sentiment as a substitute for thought. The distance between the authentic disclosure that invites genuine human connection and the performed vulnerability that claims moral authority while foreclosing critical engagement is a distance that Rousseau collapsed in the very act of inventing the genre, and we are still navigating the consequences of that collapse. Rousseau died in July 1778 at Ermenonville, in the care of the Marquis de Jourdan. In circumstances that remained disputed, the official account was a stroke, though rumors of suicide circulated, and continue to circulate, among historians. He was 66 years old. He had spent the final years of his life copying music, walking, botanizing, composing the reveries of a solitary walker. A final series of meditations on solitude and memory and the nature of happiness that contained some of the most beautiful prose he ever wrote, and that read, in retrospect, as a man making his peace not with the world, which he had long since given up on, but with himself, which was always the more difficult project, the fifth reverie, in which he describes floating alone in a boat on the lake of Bienne in a state of perfect, egoless bliss, is among the most beautiful descriptions of a meditative state in Western literature, and it is entirely characteristic of Rousseau that his most serene moment should be the moment of his greatest isolation. The moment in which the self has become so still that it is no longer in conflict with anything because it is no longer in contact with anything. Solitude as the only available form of peace. In 1794, 16 years after his death and 5 years into the French Revolution, Rousseau's remains were transferred to the Pantheon with great ceremony. Installed there by the revolutionary government as one of the founding fathers of the Republic, placed alongside the thinkers and heroes whose ideas had made the revolution possible, the ceremony was elaborate, the speeches were passionate, and the presence of Robespierre at the proceedings was noted by observers with varying degrees of comfort. Because by 1794, the connection between Rousseau's political philosophy and the trajectory of the revolution had become impossible to ignore, and impossible to interpret without considerable care. The revolution was already consuming itself. The reign of terror was at its height. The guillotine was working with industrial efficiency, and the language in which all of this was justified was unmistakably Rousseauian, the language of virtue versus corruption, of the authentic people versus the degenerate elite, of civic regeneration as the goal of political action, of the general will as the standard against which all claims to legitimacy must be measured and found either adequate or treasonous. The relationship between Rousseau's ideas and the French Revolution is one of the most contested questions in modern intellectual history, and it requires a precision that neither simple attribution nor simple exculpation provides. It is true that Rousseau did not cause the revolution. Revolutions are not caused by books. They are caused by the intersection of economic distress, political dysfunction, institutional failure, and the availability of legitimating ideas that allow those experiencing grievance to understand their situation as unjust rather than merely unfortunate. The revolution had 100 causes and 100 accelerants, and it would be absurd to reduce it to the influence of a single philosopher. It is also true, however, that the language and the conceptual framework within which the revolution was conducted was saturated with Rousseauian themes, and that certain features of the revolutionary dynamic are much more explicable within a Rousseauian framework than within any other available framework. Maximilien Robespierre was the revolutionary who most explicitly identified himself as a disciple of Rousseau, who kept a portrait of him in his rooms and described him in speeches with a reverence that veered toward worship, calling him the divine man who taught his contemporaries to be just and love virtue. and who attempted most systematically to implement something like the general will as actual political policy, the Reign of Terror, which began in 1793, and in which somewhere between 16 and 40,000 people were executed, mostly by guillotine, and many more imprisoned or driven into exile, was conducted in the name of virtue, in the name of the Republic, in the name of the general will of the French people as identified and enforced by the Committee of Public Safety. The logic was impeccable within its own premises and catastrophic in its consequences. If the general will is always right, if it is directed toward the common good, if those who resist it are merely confused about their own genuine interests, or are active agents of corruption and faction, then the violence used to enforce it is not oppression but liberation, not cruelty but civic education of the most necessary kind. The guillotine was not, in this reading, an instrument of tyranny but an instrument of purification, a means of removing from the body politic the corrupted elements that prevent the general will from expressing itself clearly and governing effectively, both because the causal chain is long and involves many intervening factors and agents, and because the ideas themselves, extracted from the context of their application, are not inherently genocidal. The general will is a philosophical concept of genuine complexity and genuine insight. The recognition that individual self-interest and genuine individual flourishing are not the same thing. That there is such a thing as a common good that is not reducible to the sum of private preferences. That genuine political freedom requires not merely the absence of external constraint, but the positive condition of shared civic life. These are not obviously false ideas. They are ideas that serious political philosophers have continued to engage with precisely because they point towards something real. The problem is not the ideas but the architecture, the absence of any reliable mechanism for distinguishing the general will from the will of those in power, the absence of any protected space for individual dissent, the absence of any institutional check on the authority that claims to speak in the name of the whole. It is the silence at the center of the system that the terror filled with blood. The broader cultural legacy of Rousseau extends far beyond any particular political movement. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries was Rousseau's most direct intellectual inheritance. The valorization of feeling over reason, of nature over civilization, of the individual conscience over institutional authority, of authentic emotion over social convention, of the artist as the one who feels most purely and therefore sees most. Truly, of childhood as the period of greatest moral clarity rather than of greatest cognitive deficiency. All of these commitments that would define European Romanticism were already fully formed in Rousseau's writing. Wordsworth and Blake and Shelley and Goethe and Schiller were all, in different ways and to different degrees, writing in the imaginative space that Rousseau had opened. And the Romantic movement was not merely an aesthetic tendency, but a cultural revolution that permanently altered the way Western societies understood the self. The emotions, nature, and the relationship between artistic expression and moral authority. Romanticism in turn fed into nationalism, the 19th century's great political innovation, which drew on many of the same themes of authentic collective identity, of the corrupting influence of cosmopolitan civilization, of the need to recover a genuine communal self that had been suppressed by artificial political arrangements, and nationalism in its various forms. Both the movements that secured genuine self-determination for oppressed peoples and the movements that organized that logic into the catastrophic nationalisms of the 20th century, is part of Rousseau's extended legacy. The modern cult of authenticity, the conviction that the true self is the self that has not been corrupted by social performance and external pressure, the self that acts from genuine feeling rather than social convention, the self that can be found beneath all the masks that civilization demands we wear. This conviction is so thoroughly absorbed into contemporary culture that it feels not like a philosophical proposition, but like a natural fact. It structures therapeutic culture, self-help culture, the language of personal growth and self-actualization, the evaluative frameworks of social media in which authentic vulnerability is the premium social currency. It organizes political movements of both the left and the right in which the claim to speak for the real people against the corrupt establishment is the primary source of legitimacy. It shapes the way we talk about art and education and relationships and moral development, and at its root, though most of its contemporary adherents would not recognize the lineage, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau weeping beneath a tree outside Paris in 1749, discovering that everything he had felt all his life about the falseness of social performance was not merely personal resentment but philosophical truth. Contemporary populism, whether of the nationalist right or the progressive left, draws heavily on a structure of political feeling that Rousseau essentially invented. The idea that there exists a genuine and virtuous people whose will constitutes the only legitimate source of political authority, that this people has been betrayed or suppressed by an elite whose interests are fundamentally opposed to the common good, that the task of authentic politics is to recover and enforce the real will of the real people against the corruptions of faction and privilege. This is Rousseauian political theology translated into the vernacular of social media and electoral competition, and it carries with it the same structural ambiguity that characterized the original, the same potential to shift from liberation to authoritarianism without any single decisive moment of transition. Because if the people have a general will that is always right, and if the leader claims to embody and express that will, then opposition to the leader is not merely political disagreement, but an act of treason against the community itself. The logic is not confined to any particular political tradition. It appears in the revolutionary nationalism of the early 19th century and in the democratic socialism of the early 20th, in the fascist movements of the interwar period, and in the anti-colonial liberation movements of the mid-century. In the cultural revolution movements of the 1960s and in the populist insurgencies of the 21st, each iteration modifies the content while preserving the structure. And the structure is Rousseauian identity politics. In its various contemporary forms, also contains deep Rousseauian DNA, the conviction that authentic identity precedes and is more real than social construction, that the damage inflicted on genuine selfhood by oppressive social systems must be healed by a return to something more authentic. That collective identity constitutes a form of general will that is morally superior to the particular interests of those who have benefited from the corrupt existing order. The language of authenticity, of speaking one's truth, of refusing the mask that the dominant culture demands, of centering those who have been excluded from the terms of the social contract. All of this draws on a moral vocabulary that Rousseau, however different the specific content, would have recognized as his own. The structural logic is the same, even when the political valences are entirely different. There is an authentic, collective self being suppressed by a corrupt system, and the restoration of that authentic self is simultaneously a political and a moral project. one that cannot be separated from questions of virtue and corruption, of genuine community and false individualism, of the real people and the elite. That speaks over them and for them and in their name without ever actually being them. The persistence of Rousseau's influence is itself a kind of evidence for one of his most unsettling claims. If his philosophy speaks with such enduring power to the discontents of modernity, this suggests that those discontents are real, that the alienation he diagnosed is not merely a projection of his personal wounds, but a genuine feature of social life under conditions of complexity. Competition, inequality, and performance. The sense of inauthenticity, of performing a self that is not quite one's own, of living in a world structured by comparisons and competitions that generate anxiety rather than satisfaction, the sense that nature or community or simplicity represents something more real than the elaborate machinery of modern life. These are not delusions. They are experiences that very many people report, and that a very large body of psychological research takes seriously. The question is not whether Rousseau was right to identify these discontents, but whether he was right about their cause, their remedy, and the political forms appropriate to addressing them. And on these latter questions, the historical record provides ample grounds for caution. The cost of choosing feeling over reason, which is in the end the deepest wager that Rousseau's philosophy places, is not that feeling is unreliable, it often is, nor that reason is always adequate, it is not. The cost is more specific and more structural. It is the cost of using feeling as a trump card that ends argument rather than enriches it, of treating the sincerity of an emotion as evidence of its moral correctness, of allowing the intensity of a conviction to substitute for the rigor of its justification, of converting the authentic expression of pain and desire into a political program without building in the institutional structures that protect against the conversion of moral passion into moral tyranny. The person who feels deeply is not thereby made right, and the community that feels its will collectively and intensely is not thereby made legitimate. These are the institutional and procedural questions that Rousseau's philosophy structurally underweights, and that the history of his influence has paid for in ways that no account of his genuine insight can afford to ignore. Rousseau knew, at some level, that he was making this wager, the loneliness of the final years, the paranoia, the wandering, the reveries written for no audience but himself, suggest a man who knew that something in the system had broken down, who could feel the costs of his own philosophy without being able to identify the precise point of failure. The reveries are the work of a man who has abandoned society, not in triumph but in exhaustion, who has found in solitude not the noble independence of the natural man but the painful quietude of the person, who has finally given up on being understood. They are beautiful and they are melancholy and they are honest in a way that the earlier philosophical works, for all their claimed honesty, were not, because they are the only works Rousseau wrote that were not addressed to an audience. He was simultaneously courting and accusing. They were addressed to himself, and in that final address there is something that might be described as wisdom, or at least as the approach to wisdom that comes from the exhaustion of all alternatives. He sits now in the Pantheon, across the rotunda from Voltaire, the two of them separated in death, as in life, by the full width of the debate between reason and feeling, between civilization as progress and civilization as corruption, between the individual protected by rights and the individual fulfilled by belonging, between the irony that protects against illusion and the sincerity that makes illusion necessary, between the writer who made readers laugh at the pretensions of the world and the writer who made them weep at what the world had cost them. And the conversation between them is not finished. It is not capable of being finished, because the tensions they represent are not resolvable by argument, but are structural features of the human situation. Features that each generation must negotiate afresh with whatever conceptual tools it inherits and whatever wisdom it manages to generate for itself. The pantheon contains them both, and the pantheon is, in this respect, more honest than either. Man individually, because it acknowledges that both poles of the debate have a legitimate claim on the attention and respect of any serious attempt to think about how human beings should live together. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born, wounded, and thought from his wounds. He was abandoned and built a philosophy of belonging. He was humiliated by society and declared society the source of all humiliation. He was incapable of sustained love and wrote the century's most influential treatise on education. He was consumed by the need for recognition and argued that the need for recognition was civilization's original sin. He was simultaneously the most sincere and the most self-deceiving of men, the most honest and the most manipulative, the most genuinely in pain and the most strategically deplored in pain. And his philosophy carries all of these contradictions within it, not as flaws that can be excised to leave a clean and usable remainder, but as constitutive features. Features that give the philosophy its power and account for its danger. You cannot separate the insight from the wound, because the insight grew from the wound, and the wound never healed. The question he asked beneath that tree in 1749 has progress. Corrupted us is a question that deserves a serious answer, not the romantic one he gave it, but a serious one. Because if it is true that the complexity and competitiveness and performativity of modern social life generate forms of suffering that simpler arrangements do not, then we have an obligation to think carefully about what we are building and what we are losing. And if it is true that collective identity and shared civic purpose can provide forms of meaning and belonging that pure individualism cannot, then we have an obligation to think carefully about the institutional conditions that allow collective life to remain humane rather than becoming coercive. These are not Rousseauian conclusions. They are conclusions that require precisely the kind of institutional thinking and the kind of tolerance for complexity that Rousseau's philosophical temperament resisted. The kind of patient procedural attention to checks and balances and protected individual rights and the permanent legitimacy of dissent that the liberalism he helped to inspire, but never fully embraced, has developed over the 2 centuries since his death. He remains, 2.5 centuries after his death, impossibly difficult to dismiss and impossible to accept whole. He was right that civilization creates suffering. It does not acknowledge he was wrong that the remedy is a return to an imagined simplicity. He was right that collective life requires something more than the aggregation of individual interests. He was wrong that this something more can be identified with certainty and enforced without tyranny. He was right that feeling is morally significant. He was wrong that feeling is morally sufficient. He was right that authenticity matters. He was wrong that it can be fully achieved, or that achieved authenticity confers political authority. He was right that the social world demands performances that distort genuine selfhood. He was wrong that the solution is to locate a genuine self that exists prior to and independent of all social formation. Because there is no such self, there is only the self that is always already social, and that must do its best within social life to remain honest. He was, in the end, a man who asked the right questions and answered them in ways that have been, in different historical contexts and by different political actors, with different intentions, both illuminating and catastrophic. What remains, finally, is not a verdict, but a question. The same question that has accompanied him through every century since his death. The question of what we owe to the thinker who saw something real and responded to it with something dangerous, who gave voice to genuine human longing and organized that voice into a form that could be turned against everything he claimed to. Love, who was, in the words that come closest to justice, neither the father of freedom nor the father of terror, but the thinker who revealed, with an honesty that the Enlightenment had not previously permitted, that freedom and terror are not opposites but, under certain conditions, the same idea wearing different faces, and that the distance between them is not measured by the sincerity of the passion that drives them, but by the quality of the institutions that contain them, the wisdom of the constraints that make liberty durable rather than merely momentary, the patience of the reason that does not replace feeling, but does not allow feeling to go alone into the world unguarded and unanswerable. The camera, if we imagine one, pulls back now from the pantheon, from the marble and the dim light, from the inscription that hails him as the one who restored the dignity of man and helped prepare the way for the freedom of peoples, and moves outward through the streets of Paris, streets that have been reordered and rebuilt and bloodied and rebuilt again in the centuries since he walked them, streets in which the debates he inaugurated are conducted daily in forms he would not recognize, and might not understand, but would certainly, in some register of his remarkable and ruined sensibility, feel, because the argument he made was never only about politics or philosophy or history. It was about what it costs to be a person in a world that was not designed with persons in mind. What it costs to feel in a world organized around performance. What it costs to belong in a world organized around competition. What it costs to be genuine in a world that rewards the accomplished pretense of genuineness. These costs are real. They were real in the 18th century, and they are real now, and the man who named them, however inadequate his remedies, however self-serving his diagnoses, however dangerous his political conclusions, deserves to be remembered for the naming, because naming is where all serious thought begins, because feeling, unguarded and unanswerable, was what Rousseau was, and because the century that followed him learned, at an enormous cost in blood and grief and extinguished possibility, exactly what that means, and because we, inheriting both his insights and the consequences of his errors, are still learning it, still working out the terms of an answer to the question he could not stop asking. What would it mean to be free, really free? Not merely free from external constraint, but free from the internal distortions that social life introduces into the self. Free to feel and to think and to act from a place of genuine integrity. What institutions would make this possible? What constraints would protect rather than destroy it? What forms of collective life would nurture rather than suppress the individual? Conscience, these are Rousseau's questions, and they are ours. And the fact that we do not yet have satisfying answers is not his failure alone. It is the condition of the unfinished project that civilization has always been and may always remain. The project of making a world in which human beings can, without too much loss, be fully what they are.